So there it is, the engine and transmission are finally bolted together, but I do have a confession to make. I forgot. Getting the little Kubota D722 engine to mate to the Saturn 5-speed transmission requires some ingenuity. There's certainly many different ways to design the components to bring these two driveline parts together. Today we're going to focus on the method or methods that don't require us to purchase specialized equipment, and we'll only use the tools that we have available in our workshop. Now, I wish I could say that we only used common tools that most do-it-yourselfers have access to, but that's not necessarily the case. Let's check it out. So in the previous video, we fabricated the clutch assembly by modifying a Saturn flywheel to bolt up to the Kubota flywheel. With this step of the process complete, theoretically, we built a path to transfer the rotational motion of the engine to the input of the transmission. This, of course, is a big step in pairing the two components together, and was the logical first step. You see, with the engine's power mechanically linked to the transmission input shaft, all we need to do now is figure out a way to actually bolt the two together. What we didn't show you in the previous episode was this template that we designed off camera. And with the template, we figured the process of constructing the engine to transmission adapters would be easy peasy. After all, this template contains all the critical dimensions for every nut and bolt needed for this swap. It turns out the template was indeed awesome, but creating a steel copy of this template was a lot more difficult than originally thought. So these videos are for entertainment purposes only, but some people do learn from them. While I doubt anybody will copy this engine swap experiment, there's a lot of ideas that can be gleaned from this video for other projects. For instance, if diesel engines aren't your thing and you want to make an electric car, well, the process to adopt the motor to the transmission is more or less the same. In the end, we were able to fabricate our engine to transmission adapter with the following tools: a drill, an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel and a sanding disc, some rulers and calipers, a 3-in-1 lathe combo, and a plasma cutter. Nope, we ain't using the plasma cutter. What's that? Future Jimbo has something to say. I said, we ain't using the plasma cutter. Alright, well, we'll see about that. That plasma cutter seems like a good idea to me. Anyway, the last tool on our list is the 3D printer. Yep, the 3D printer came in handy several times, mostly because we could design precision one-off tools or fixtures and then print them out. Alright, so the template we built is key to getting all this stuff to fit together. Let me walk you through the process of how we made this template. This, of course, is the transmission that we want to mate our Kubota Diesel engine to. Over here we have the input shaft to the transmission, the release bearing, and the clutch release arm. On our car, the clutch release arm is connected to a hydraulic linkage that moves the arm in and out depending on the position of the clutch pedal. It's all basic stuff. One of the anomalies or features that this transmission has is the input shaft is relatively short and the shaft doesn't have an extension normally seen on older transmissions. And typically this extension is for the pilot bearing. My understanding is this is normal on modern transmissions. Anyway, we can see that the input shaft is about 7 millimeters or a touch more than a 1/4 inch below the bell housing. The shorter input shaft sort of complicates things when making a template, but we have a solution. I reckon at this stage, the most important thing to keep in mind is everything that we build has to be perfectly centered around the input shaft, and that's without exception. So the transmission adapter plate, or actually in this case adapter plates, because we're going to be making more than one. Anyway, the plates are going to be fabricated from a 1/4 inch or 6.35 millimeter steel plates. The steel that we're using is A36 mild carbon steel. It's pretty much common stuff and it'll be pretty strong for our project. The problem is, when we place this thick chunk of steel over the transmission bell housing, now we can't see anything. And that's fine, because you really shouldn't be able to see through steel, unless your name's Clark Kent. So for our template, we're going to use a 1/4 inch thick polycarbonate or plexiglass. Now, I'm not really sure what this stuff is. Anyway, we're going to call it plexiglass. I think they call this stuff perspex over in the UK. And yeah, I know plexiglass and polycarbonate are different, yada yada yada. I think the fact checkers need to take a break on this one. Anyway, the plexiglass helps the viewers visualize what we're doing in this video and perhaps may not be necessary. However, it does work great for building a template. So with the plexiglass in place, we can still see the input shaft and we'll need to deal with that in due time. But first we need to deal with this area here because the axle seal protrudes a bit and it's keeping our plexiglass from sitting flat on the bell housing. So we're going to need to cut a hole here and then we can deal with the input shaft. Now I'm going to mark the approximate location of the center of the axle with this paint pen, and then we can drill a clearance hole in the plexiglass. The difference between polycarbonate and plexiglass is polycarbonate's easier to drill, and this stuff drills nice, so it may be polycarbonate, but we're still going to call it plexiglass. With the pilot hole drilled, now we can cut the bigger hole with this nasty worn out hole cutter. This hole cutter took a while to cut through the plexiglass, and we had to use water to keep the bit cool, otherwise it would just melt the plastic and stop the drill press. Okay, well let's place the plexiglass back on the bell housing. Yeah, that clearance hole really helps things out. Now the next logical step for some folks is to use transfer punches, and in some cases that may work. But in our case, the holes in the bell housing are stepped, and this makes using a transfer punch pretty much impossible. So let's work around that. With the clearance hole more or less centered, we can get an idea where the center of the input shaft is, and now we can mark the approximate location with this paint pen. Don't worry, we'll get everything perfectly centered in due time, but first we need to establish a starting point. Okay, at this point, we need to determine approximately where the top of the transmission is. So this will use some tape. Now when this transmission's in the car, this tape line should be more or less level with the rest of the car. So this ruler was placed directly over the tape that we just applied to the plexiglass, and it's been clamped in place on both sides. Right here we can see the paint mark that shows the approximate location of the center of the input shaft. Now we're not going to show you the tedious process of measuring all this stuff, but the point is we want to scribe both a vertical and horizontal line in the plexiglass, and like I said, this bit here requires a lot of measuring, and we don't rely on the T-square to make sure our scribe lines are at right angles. These scribe lines will be important later when we line the engine up. So fast forward a bit and we have our lines scribed into the plexiglass, and the exact center of the input shaft is marked. So at this point we went ahead and measured the diameter of each of the holes in the transmission bell housing, and then modeled them in Tinkercad. That way we can 3D print the special hole plugs that we'll need in the next step. The first 3D part that we'll use is the input shaft center plug, and this part will be placed at the center of the scribe lines that we made earlier. But first we have to drill a hole. This takes a while, so we'll fast forward it a bit. Now we can screw the input shaft center plug into the plexiglass. Up to this point, there's the potential for a limited amount of slop, but once this part's screwed into the plexiglass, everything resets to 0 again. Let's see how the plexiglass fits now. Awesome! Now we have the true center located on our template, and we can work on getting the other holes transferred to the template. So let's start with this hole. In order to transfer the location of this hole to the plexiglass, we're going to use another 3D printed plug. Now I apologize because it's hard to see, but this plug has a steel screw going through it, and the tip of the screw has been sharpened to a very fine point. So let's slip the plug under the plexiglass and into the hole on the bell housing. And now we can give the plexiglass a few taps with a hammer, and the center of the hole will be precisely transferred to the plexiglass. So now we can drill a hole in the plexiglass where it's marked and screw another 3D plug into it. After the plug's screwed into the plexiglass, we can move into the next hole and then the next one, and eventually we'll have all the holes precisely marked. Alright, so our plexiglass template is definitely taking shape, and all the bell housing holes have been transferred. Let's see how well this fits the bell housing. It's amazingly easy how this slides into place, and I reckon we were able to transfer each hole precisely in the right location on the template. The last step in the bell housing template is to cut it into shape, and for that we'll use a specialized blade in my saber saw. Hopefully this all made sense. Hey, let's take a look at the finished template. Now after we cut the template into shape, it was painted with Rust-Oleum primer. The reason I mention Rust-Oleum primer is the plexiglass or polycarbonate will react to paints or primers that use aggressive solvents, but Rust-Oleum primer is pretty much benign and will coat the plexiglass without harming the surface. But at the same time, this primer really doesn't stick well to the plexiglass and is easily chipped or scratched. Anyway, the template fits perfectly, so that's a relief. So no doubt you noticed the red line that goes around this template. Well, let me explain that. You see, this red line is the outline of the Kubota engine plate that's bolted to the back of our little diesel engine. Now, this may be hard to visualize, so let's do some video magic to make things easier to understand. That's better. So this is the Kubota engine plate, and it fits our template perfectly, and we used it as a drill template to mark the locations of some of the additional holes that will need to be drilled. Let's take a look. So these are the holes that we'll use to bolt our custom-made engine adapter plate to the Kubota engine plate. I reckon now that we have all the bolt holes that we need precisely marked, we can move forward with building the adapter. So this is the 1/4 inch thick A36 steel plate that we'll be using to make the adapter from. And as you can see here, the template is firmly screwed to the steel plate in 2 locations. There's absolutely no chance that the template could move at this point. Also take note that we already traced the outline of the template to the steel plate with a blue Sharpie. Now, as a personal preference and an aid to making this video, the steel plate was first cleaned and then painted to provide a high contrast. This comes in handy for filming, and more importantly, it helps later when we have to cut the steel plate into shape. So now we can use a transfer punch to transfer the holes from our template to the steel plate. Keep in mind, there's still a possibility of transferring our hole pattern incorrectly, so we went ahead and 3D printed a transfer punch holder. This gizmo will hold our transfer punch perfectly vertical when we transfer the hole pattern to the steel. Now we only need a few light taps on the punch to leave a mark on the steel plate. After we mark all the hole locations, we'll remove the template and go back and restrike the locations to make a deeper center punch. The idea here is not to put a lot of stress on our template. With all the holes marked, now we need to draw a pattern for the circle that we need to cut out of the center of this adapter. And for this, we used the 3D printed circle maker thingy. This might be over the top, but we had a 3D printer and this was easy to design. Just for fun, I also circled and numbered all the punch marks that we'll need to drill out later. So now is the fun part, cutting the 1/4 inch steel plate. Well, apparently future Jimbo was correct, and we ain't gonna use the plasma cutter to cut this steel plate. Now I suspect the plasma cutter was more than capable of cutting this steel, but about 10 seconds after we started cutting, the plasma cutter released a big cloud of toxic smoke and completely died. And it's a shame, this plasma cutter was donated to the channel by my good friend Eddie, and apparently it made its last cut. Well, to answer your question, Ed, the cutter did work, but now it doesn't. I certainly appreciate the gift, but I think we're going to use an angle grinder to finish cutting these steel plates. So I'm not a big fan of angle grinders because of the dust they produce. However, when paired with a decent cutting wheel, they're awesome. To cut these plates, the technique I used was to mount the plates in a vise for stability, and I also put the steel at the right height so I could do all my cutting while standing up. I'm no expert, but the best way to cut this steel is to start from the bottom and work your way up. On the first pass, we only did a light cut to establish the cut line. Then we made several more light passes until we cut through the steel. Here, let me show you. Now at the bottom of the pattern, we have to cut a non-straight line. I guess you would call this an arc. Anyway, this angle grinder or the operator can't really cut this arc completely through, and our strategy was to cut at least halfway through and then finish the cut with the saber saw. The saber saw has an easy time cutting through the remaining material, and with the smaller blade we minimize any defects to the cutting edge. After that, we used an angle grinder with a fresh sanding disc and dressed all the edges for a perfect finish. Now that we have the steel plate cut to size, it will now fit on the Smithy 1220 3-in-1 mill lathe and drill press combo. This machine is primarily used as a lathe, but I have used it as a mill on occasions. But as a mill, it ain't so good. You see, this thing is too lightweight to do any serious mill cuts, but it'll do small parts. So after about 20 years of ownership, this is the first time I'm actually using it as a drill press. Anyway, we figured we would drill out all our holes before we cut the center of the adapter out. And here you can see the plate securely clamped to the mill bed. For the first pass, we're using a center drill bit to establish a good center, I guess. I'm not really a machinist, but this seemed like the right thing to do. Next, we open up the hole a little bit more with a different bit. And guess what? Now we change bits and open up the hole a little bit more. Then the final hole is cut to the exact size we need. Now keep in mind, we had to do this to all the holes in both of the adapter plates that we built. It's tedious work. So with all the holes drilled, we were ready to cut out the center of the adapter. Now, once again, we used the angle grinder to cut halfway through the steel and then finished it up with the saber saw. The slightly rough edge on the inside of the adapter plate was then finished to perfection with the sanding disc. Of course, the plates need to look pretty, so we cleaned them up a bit and then shot them with Rust-Oleum primer and then a top coat of Rust-Oleum gray paint to match the paint on the Kubota engine. So fast forward a bit and the paint is dry, and now you can see the two adapter plates that we fabricated. I reckon you also noticed these things. Well, these are the spacers that we'll need to bolt everything together. This group of spacers was purchased from McMaster Car, and they're 3/8 of an inch or 9.5 millimeters thick. These guys were custom made on our lathe and are exactly 16 millimeters thick. These are also 16 millimeters thick. Now, these weird looking things fit on the back side of the bell housing because the bolts we're going to use will be smaller in diameter than the ones Saturn used. These guys here will fit on the front side of the bell housing, and again, that's because we're using smaller diameter bolts. So, not too shabby. Everything looks good, and I guess we need to see if it all fits. So here's the setup. Over here you can see that the cylinder head on the engine overhangs the block by 3/8 of an inch or about 9.5 millimeter. Because of this, we couldn't make the adapter plate bolt directly to the engine and we have to use spacers, but we'll get to that in a minute. These grade 8 3/8 bolts will go through both adapter plates and then into the transmission. We're using 3 of these SAE threaded bolts, and the remaining 3 bolts will be metric thread. Why? Because America, and that's the way we do stuff here. These 5/16 bolts are used to bolt both adapter plates together. Now we're going to use 4 of these bolts along with some spacers. Anyway, enough talk, let's put this together. So this is one of the 7 3/8 spacers that we'll be using. This bolt, by the way, is metric because Japan, and I guess that's how they do things over there. So this bolt is one of the original metric Saturn bolts, and we were able to keep this one because it will fit. Now these holes down here will also use metric bolts, but we have to order them, because here in the colonies these are going to be hard to find, so we'll leave them out for now. Well, that's most of the bolts, well, the important ones anyway. I reckon now we need to install the clutch, and then we can test fit this engine to the transmission. If you're interested in how the clutch was fabricated, check out the previous episode for all the details. And yeah, I know, one of the flywheel bolts is not installed. Okay, let me stop the video for a moment and let me share some information a viewer left in the comments section on the last video. Now at this point when installing the clutch you can see the fingers. That's these things right here. Anyway, you'll notice that they extend past the pressure plate housing. Let's take a snapshot. The point I'm trying to make is, when I tighten the pressure plate to the flywheel, these fingers will move into the pressure plate, and that's fine. The thing to remember is, when the clutch disc starts wearing out, these fingers will slowly come back out of the pressure plate, and that's totally normal. The thing to consider if you plan on making or engineering an engine adapter is, you need to allow for extra space, otherwise the clutch will start slipping prematurely. Now this is something I didn't know, but thankfully a viewer reached out and we made some changes to account for the extra space. Alright, roll tape. And stop. Let's take a snapshot. Alright, well here are the two pictures with the fingers. Keep this in mind if you plan on making your own stuff in the future. And thank you to the person who pointed that out in the comment section. I reckon it's time to see if this engine fits the transmission. So there it is, the engine and transmission are finally bolted together, but I do have a confession to make. I forgot that the right side axle on a Saturn is a two-piece axle, and that's going to make things more difficult. I'll show you what I'm talking about in a minute, but first let's take a look at how it all fits. Well, first of all, the engine more or less slipped right into the transmission. There was some wiggling involved, but no more than expected. So it looks like we did a decent job making the template and transferring the holes to the adapters. Now this is one of the bolts that go all the way through, and here you can see one of the aluminum bushings that we made to compensate for the smaller diameter bolts. Over here you can get a better view, and this sort of explains why we had to use smaller bolts. So hopefully you can see that the bolt just clears the cylinder head on this side of the adapter plate. Now the other top bolt is buried between the plate and the cylinder head and only clears by 0.5 millimeter, so that's a tight fit. The bottom bolt on the front side of the engine doesn't appear to have any clearance issues, and we may replace this bolt with a larger one, but for now it seems to fit fine. For the last big bolt on the opposite side of the engine, we use a genuine Saturn bolt. We did this because the bolt threads into the transmission bell housing and we really had no choice. Now this bolt is bottomed out in the case, so we'll need to fabricate another spacer to take up the slack. By the way, all the spacers we fabricated were of 6061 aluminum alloy. Now let's look at the problem with the axle. Well, the oil filter gets in the way, but we kinda knew that may happen, and we have a solution for that. You see, we can relocate the oil filter to the other side of the engine because this engine has provisions for that. Watch this. Alright, so the filter's been relocated. Let's see how the axle fits now. Well, it slides in and that's good, but the support bearing's kinda hitting the injector pump housing. Let's take a closer look. So yeah, the support bearing is going to be a problem, but I figure we can slice it here and eliminate the part that's hitting the injector pump. That'll still leave 2 mounting bolts for the bearing, and we can build a bracket for the bearing and attach it to the engine block. We have plenty of places on the block to bolt the bracket to, so this axle problem can be easily solved. And we'll have that sorted out when we install the engine in the Saturn in the next episode. We might even get it running, but I can't promise that. If you want to keep up to date as we move forward with this project, consider subscribing. I know a lot of folks have done that recently, and thank you for that. As always, feel free to leave a comment, and we'll see you next time. Until then.